Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder how much your listening skills actually affect the person talking to you, especially when you are sharing something personal? We all know that when someone's really paying attention to us, we feel better. But what about the nitty-gritty, actual moment-to-moment stuff? Does a quick nod or a glance away from the speaker change how they're feeling right now? And does it matter if we're talking in person or over a video call? Today, we're diving into a fascinating study that explores exactly that. This paper, looking at how our listening faces and actions change the speaker's feelings in real time, is super interesting. Think about it. You are telling a friend about a tough time, and they're really tuned in, nodding along. How does that make you feel? Or what if they're glancing at their phone? Does that shift your emotions? This research dug into these detailed interactions. So the big question here is, how do specific listener behaviors like nodding or where they look actually change a speaker's emotions as they're talking? Second by second, the researchers set up an experiment where people talked about emotional experiences. Some listeners had to pay close attention, while others had a distraction. They watched things like nodding eye gaze and smiling, and measured the speaker's emotional state, specifically their body's arousal level. The introduction tells us that we all constantly regulate each other's emotions through social interaction. It is not just about what we say, but how we listen. But it has been tricky to see exactly how the listener's specific actions, like eye contact or a nod, cause moment-to-moment changes in the speaker's feelings. This is important because technology, like video calls, can mess with these natural interactions. So the scientists wanted to see if disruptions in listener attention changed their behavior, and then if that behavior changed the speaker's emotions. They also wanted to see if this was different in face-to-face versus video calls. Think about how we show we're listening, we look at the speaker, we nod, maybe we smile, these are all signals. But sometimes we might look engaged but be distracted, or seem disengaged but be paying close attention. The researchers wanted to map out how attention turns into visible engagement behaviors, and then how those behaviors affect the speaker. They figured that things like failing to respond or provide feedback can make the speaker feel stressed. And that listener disengagement can increase a speaker's stress, but they wanted to get down to the nitty-gritty, the moment-to-moment stuff. To get a handle on this, the researchers designed an experiment. They had people engage in an emotional self-disclosure task. Imagine being asked to tell a story about overcoming a challenge for 3 minutes. Participants either talked face-to-face or via video call. Critically, the listeners were either fully paying attention or were given a mental math task to do at the same time. This mental math task was the attentional distractor, designed to split their focus. So here is how it worked. Each pair of people took turns being the speaker and the listener. The speaker would tell a personal story about overcoming adversity for 3 minutes. For the listener, there were 2 conditions: really paying attention, or paying attention while doing a serial addition task in their mind. This math task was the key to dividing their attention and making them disengaged. They measured listener behaviors like nodding, gaze, and smiling, and tracked the speaker's excitement levels using something called autonomic arousal, which is basically how much their body's stress response system was activated, measured through skin conductance. They used fancy tech to measure these things. For nodding, they analyzed head movements from video. For gaze, they tracked where the listener was looking. And for smiling, they measured facial muscle activity. For the speaker's emotional state, they looked at their skin conductance, a common way to measure arousal. They also asked speakers how they felt afterward. So, what did they find about how listening behaviors changed based on attention? They discovered that when listeners were distracted, they nodded less. This was true in both face-to-face and video call settings. Interestingly, people actually nodded more in general during video calls compared to face-to-face. But the distraction still made them nod less regardless of the medium. Here is where it gets interesting. When listeners were distracted, their gaze became much more scattered. They looked around more. This happened more in video calls than face-to-face when they were distracted. This supports the idea that distractions really pull our attention away, making our eyes wander. The study also found that distracted listeners smiled less. However, this effect was stronger in video calls than in person. When people are distracted and on a video call, they seem to express less positive emotion through smiling. Now, the crucial part: how did these listener behaviors affect the speaker's emotions? Testing hypotheses H2 and H3 at the level of the whole encounter, speakers' autonomic arousal was predicted from listeners' attentional disengagement and specific engagement behaviors. At the level of the whole conversation, the impact was surprisingly subtle. This table shows the results for the entire conversation. There wasn't a strong direct link between the listener's distraction and the speaker's overall arousal. However, there was a trend. Nodding by the listener seemed to slightly reduce the speaker's arousal, especially when the listener was distracted. This is the first hint that nodding might have a calming effect. This is where the real magic happens, looking at what happens second by second. This figure shows the moment-to-moment connections. It turns out that listener nodding, gaze diversion, and smiling are all linked to brief spikes in the speaker's arousal. So, when a listener's gaze diverts away from the speaker's arousal goes up about 5 seconds later. The same happened with smiling. Nodding showed a weaker connection, but it was there too. This is the core finding of the moment-to-moment analysis. These weren't just random coincidences in the data. The researchers used a clever method to make sure these connections were real and not just noise. They compared the actual interaction data to shuffled fake interactions. The real connections were much stronger, showing that these listener actions genuinely influence the speaker's arousal in the moment. Here, they broke it down further. For gaze, the effect of the listener looking away was stronger in face-to-face interactions than in video calls. This supports their third hypothesis. It suggests that when someone directly looks away from you in person, it is more impactful than if they do it on a screen. And for smiling, the connection between listener smiling and speaker arousal was stronger when the listener was fully attentive than when they were distracted. This suggests that a smile from an engaged listener has a bigger effect on the speaker's arousal. So, what does all this mean? The study clearly shows that listener attention is translated into behaviors like nodding gaze and smiling. And these behaviors, in turn, affect the speaker's emotions, especially on a second-by-second basis, while nodding reduced arousal over the whole conversation, moment to moment. Both nodding and smiling seem to increase the speaker's arousal. The researchers suggest this might be because these are like social rewards. They can be positive signals that momentarily excite the speaker. Gaze diversion, on the other hand, clearly increased arousal, especially in person, probably because it feels like rejection or a lack of being heard. It is important to note who was in the study. Most participants were Finnish university students. So while the findings are exciting, we should be a little cautious about applying them to everyone everywhere, as cultural norms and individual differences can play a role. The researchers also point out that while they found strong links, proving direct cause and effect is tricky. Also, the video call setup had slight differences in how they recorded, which might have influenced things. But they did a good job of looking at changes within individuals. They also mentioned that future studies could look at how verbal cues and more context about the conversation could add even more insight. Ultimately, this research gives us a really clear picture of how we influence each other's emotions in conversations. Listeners' engagement, even their fleeting actions like a glance or a nod, matters. It shapes the speaker's emotional state second by second. This is especially true in person and when the listener is fully attentive. Technology like video calls seems to weaken some of these connections, making us less sensitive to listener cues. What I find so cool about this study is how it highlights the delicate dance of interpersonal emotion regulation. It is not just about being a good listener, it is about how your every micro action helps or hinders the speaker's emotional state. For example, that fleeting moment where someone's gaze drifts during a sensitive story in person might feel like a small thing, but it can spike the speaker's arousal. It makes me think about how much more mindful we can be in our interactions, whether they're face-to-face or online. This research opens up so many possibilities. Imagine applying this to therapy where a therapist's engagement could be subtly optimized for better patient outcomes, or in customer service where attentive listening might be key to de-escalating a situation. The researchers propose that these listener behaviors act like social rewards, and their absence can be perceived as a threat, tapping into our basic motivational systems. It's a powerful reminder that we are deeply wired for social connection, and our emotional states are constantly being shaped by those around us. What are your thoughts on this? Have you ever felt a shift in your emotions based on how someone was listening to you? Second by second, let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this dive into the science of connection, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.